When I gave them my mother's china set, my daughter-in-law tossed it in a donation box and said, "Nobody wants your old dead energy." My son said, "It's just stuff, Dad." That night, I walked into the attic and pulled out one box they had no idea existed. Inside was something that would strip her name from everything she thought she secured. I used to believe that the things we keep are never just things. They're anchors, quiet, steady reminders of who we were, what we built, and who we loved along the way. My late wife, Alina, understood that better than anyone. She had a way of turning ordinary objects into something sacred, not through money, but through memory. The china set was one of those things. It wasn't extravagant, no gold leaf, no famous maker's mark, just a simple ivory set with a thin blue pattern circling the edges, but Alina loved it. She'd found it at a small antique shop in Vermont during a rainy anniversary trip. I remember how she stood there, fingers lightly tracing the rim of a teacup, smiling like she'd just uncovered buried treasure. "We'll use this for every holiday," she told me. And we did. Thanksgivings, Christmas mornings, even the occasional Sunday dinner when she felt like making something special for no reason at all. Over time, the set became part of the rhythm of our life. The soft clink of plates, the careful way she'd wrap each piece after washing, it all felt permanent. Or at least I thought it was. Alina passed away 6 years ago. Cancer, slow, methodical, unforgiving. After she was gone, the house became quieter in a way I still haven't found the words for. Not empty, just muted, like someone had turned the volume of life down and forgotten to turn it back up. For a while, I didn't touch the china. It stayed in the cabinet, exactly where she left it. Dust gathered slowly, but I didn't mind. It felt wrong to disturb it, like I'd be erasing something I wasn't ready to lose. My son Daniel tried to help in his own way. He visited more often at first, bringing his wife Clea along with him. Clea was efficient, that's the best word I can use. Organized, practical, always thinking about space and function and modern living. She didn't like clutter. The first time she mentioned the china set, she said it lightly, almost like a joke. "You still keeping all that old stuff in there?" she asked, nodding toward the cabinet. I shrugged. "Your mother loved it." Clea smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, but you don't even use it, right?" She wasn't wrong. Still, there are things you don't measure by use. Daniel, on the other hand, avoided the topic entirely. He had always been like that, uncomfortable with anything that lingered too long in the emotional space. If something couldn't be fixed quickly, he preferred not to touch it at all. Over time, their visits became less frequent. Work, they said, busy schedules, life moving forward. I understood, or at least I told myself I did. When Daniel finally suggested I downsize, move into something smaller, more manageable, I didn't argue much. The house was too big for one person anyway, and the maintenance had started to wear on me. The plan was simple. I would move into a smaller place nearby. They would take some of the larger furniture pieces, things that made more sense in a family home. The rest, we would sort through together. That's how the china set came up again. We were standing in the dining room, surrounded by half-packed boxes. Sunlight filtered through the curtains Alina had picked out years ago, casting soft patterns across the table. Clea opened the cabinet before I could say anything. "Oh wow," she said, pulling out one of the plates. "This is the set you were talking about." I nodded. She turned it over in her hands, examining it like an item on clearance. "It's nice, in a vintage way." Daniel glanced over briefly. "You want it?" Clea hesitated for a second, then she smiled. "Sure, we could probably use it for something." Probably. That word should have meant something to me at the time. But I was tired of sorting, tired of deciding what parts of my life would fit into smaller spaces, so I just nodded. "Your mother would have liked that," I said quietly. Clea placed the plate back into the box, already moving on to the next item. "Great, we'll take it with the rest." That should have been the end of it. A simple transfer, one generation passing something down to the next. That's what I believed, anyway. That night after they left, I sat alone in the half-empty house. The cabinet stood open now, its shelves bare. For the first time since Alina bought that set, the space looked ordinary. Just wood and glass. I remember thinking that maybe this was what moving on looked like. Letting things go, trusting that the people you pass them to will understand their weight, even if they don't feel it the same way you do. I told myself that Daniel would keep it safe. That Clea, in her own way, would find a place for it. I told myself a lot of things. And for a few days, I believed them. Until the afternoon, I stopped by their house unannounced and saw something sitting by the curb that made me realize just how wrong I had been. It wasn't supposed to be anything significant. I had been in the neighborhood to finalize paperwork for the new apartment, just a few signatures, a brief meeting, nothing that required much thought. On my way back, I realized I was only 10 minutes from Daniel's place. I hadn't called ahead. At the time, it didn't feel necessary. He was my son. His home wasn't a place I needed permission to visit. That assumption would stay with me right up until the moment I pulled up to the curb. It was trash day. Large plastic bins lined the street in neat rows, lids half open, the faint smell of discarded things drifting through the air. Cardboard boxes sat beside them, some broken down, others still intact, overflow from whatever spring cleaning impulse had taken hold of the neighborhood. I parked slowly, my eyes scanning without intention. And then they stopped. There was a box sitting near the edge of their driveway. Open, unsealed, careless. I don't know what made me step out of the car. Maybe it was instinct, maybe something in me already knew. The box wasn't labeled, but I recognized the packing paper immediately. The same thick, slightly yellowed sheets I had used days earlier when we wrapped Alina's china. My hands didn't shake when I walked over. That came later. At first, everything felt oddly calm, detached, like I was watching someone else move through the motions. I reached into the box and peeled back the top layer of paper. The first thing I saw was a plate. One of the larger ones, the dinner plates Alina had insisted we use even for small meals because, as she used to say, why save the good things for later? There was a crack running through it. Not a small one, a clean, decisive fracture from edge to center, like something had struck it without hesitation. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I noticed the rest. Bowls stacked unevenly, some chipped, others intact but tossed in without care. Teacups resting on their sides, handles pressing into one another. The entire set, what remained of it, reduced to a jumble of fragile things treated like they were already broken. Like they didn't matter. That's when the calm started to slip. I heard the front door open behind me. "Hey, what are you doing?" Clea's voice. Bright, slightly annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something trivial. I turned slowly, the plate still in my hands. She stepped down the porch, glancing briefly at the box before looking back at me. There was no hesitation in her expression, no flicker of recognition that what I was holding meant anything beyond its physical form. "Oh," she said, like she'd just remembered. "That." I waited. She crossed her arms casually. "Yeah, I was going to drop that off at a donation center, but honestly, it's not really worth much. Some of it's already cracked." I lowered the plate carefully, setting it back into the box as if the gesture itself still held meaning. "Cracked," I repeated. Clea shrugged. "Probably happened during the move. Those things are old, they don't hold up." "Old?" I let the words sit there. Behind her, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He looked from me to the box, then back again, already bracing for something he didn't want to deal with. "Dad," he said, stepping outside, "it's just stuff." There it was. Simple, plain, final. Just stuff. I looked at him, really looked this time, and realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. He meant it. There was no cruelty in his tone, no intent to hurt. If anything, there was a quiet impatience, like this was a conversation he didn't think should exist in the first place. Clea, on the other hand, had no such restraint. She stepped closer, peering into the box again. "Honestly, I don't know why people hang on to things like this. It's just old energy." I didn't respond. She glanced at me, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Nobody wants your old dead energy." The words landed harder than they should have. Not because they were loud, but because they were careless. There's a difference between someone trying to hurt you and someone who doesn't consider you at all. The second one cuts deeper. Daniel sighed softly. "Clea." "What?" she said, not backing down. "I'm just being honest." I straightened up slowly, brushing the dust from my hands. The air felt different now, thinner, sharper. "You said you'd keep it," I said, my voice steady. Clea tilted her head. "We said we'd take it. That doesn't mean we have to keep everything forever." Daniel stepped in, his tone more measured. "Dad, we don't have the space, and it's not like it's, valuable." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Value. Such a simple concept, when you remove everything that actually gives something meaning. I looked back at the box one last time. At the fractured plate. At the cups Elena had once wrapped so carefully. At the quiet, deliberate life that had been reduced to a curbside decision. And then I nodded. Not in agreement. Not in understanding. Just acknowledgement. "I see," I said. Clea relaxed slightly, as if the moment had passed. "We can find you something nicer, something more current." Something more current. I didn't respond to that. Instead, I walked back to my car, each step measured, controlled. Behind me, I heard Daniel say something, maybe my name, but I didn't turn around. There was nothing left to say out there on the curb. Nothing that would change what had already been done. But something had shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Because as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at my hands resting on the wheel, a thought settled into place with quiet clarity. They believed they had already decided what mattered. They believed they understood what was worth keeping and what wasn't. And more importantly, they believed they had seen everything there was to see. That night, for the first time in years, I went up into the attic. There were only a few boxes left up there, things we hadn't sorted yet, things I hadn't had the energy to go through. I moved past most of them without looking. I knew exactly which one I was there for. It sat in the far corner, partially hidden behind an old trunk, smaller than the others, plain, unmarked. Forgotten, or so they thought. I pulled it forward slowly, the wood creaking beneath my weight. For a moment, I just stood there, looking down at it. Then I knelt, brushed the dust from the lid, and opened it. Inside was something neither Daniel nor Clea had ever asked about. Something Elena had made sure of. And as I stared at it in the dim attic light, I realized one simple, undeniable truth. They hadn't just thrown away a memory. They had made a decision. One that would cost them far more than they could possibly understand. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry, at least not in the way people expect. There was no packing, no shouting into empty rooms, no dramatic unraveling. What I felt was quieter than that. Heavier. Like something fundamental had shifted, and my mind was still trying to catch up to it. The box sat open on the floor beside me as I remained in the attic, long after the sun had set. A single bulb overhead cast a dull, yellow light over everything, making the dust in the air look almost suspended in time. Inside that box was the part of Elena's life she had never displayed. Not because she was hiding it, but because she understood something most people don't: timing matters more than truth. On top was a folder, plain, thick and worn at the edges, beneath it a smaller velvet case, and under that documents carefully sealed, labeled in her handwriting. I picked up the folder first. Even before opening it, I knew what it was. Elena had shown it to me once, years ago, on a night that felt strangely ordinary at the time. We had been sitting at the kitchen table, the china set laid out in front of us after dinner. She had poured tea, her movements calm, deliberate. "If anything ever happens to me," she said, sliding the folder across the table, "this stays with you. Not with Daniel, not with anyone else. You decide when it matters." I remember frowning. "What is it?" "Leverage," she said simply. I almost laughed back then. Elena wasn't the type for manipulation or games. She believed in fairness, in patience, in letting people reveal themselves over time. But she also believed in being prepared. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies, bank statements, investment records, ownership documents, but not in my name, not in hers exactly. In Daniel. Or rather, in a version of Daniel's future that had never been fully explained to him. Elena had set things up years ago, quietly, carefully. A trust. Conditional. Everything from a portion of her family's land I knew Daniel had always assumed would pass to him automatically, to several long-term investments that had grown substantially over the years. On paper, it looked straightforward. Daniel was the beneficiary, but only under specific conditions. I leaned back slightly, the weight of it settling in. We had talked about this once briefly. Alina had mentioned wanting to make sure Daniel was ready before he inherited anything significant. Not financially ready, he already did well for himself, but grounded. Respectful. Aware of what things cost, not just in money, but in time, in care, in meaning. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. It felt like something that would sort itself out naturally. Now I understood what she had really been doing. The velvet case came next. Inside was a ring. Not extravagant, no oversized stone or elaborate setting, but I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to Alina's mother. A family piece passed down with quiet intention through generations. Alina rarely wore it. She used to say it wasn't meant for display, it was meant for transition. For the right person, she told me once. I turned it slightly in the light, watching the way it caught even the dimmest glow. Clea had never seen this. Daniel didn't even know it existed. And suddenly that felt important. I set the ring aside and went back to the documents. That's when I found the clause. It wasn't hidden, not exactly, just buried in the kind of language most people skim past without a second thought. A behavioral condition. Not tied to income, not tied to milestones like marriage or children. It was tied to conduct. Specifically, how Daniel and his immediate household handled family-designated heirlooms and assets of sentimental or historical value. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. Alina had been precise. Any demonstrated pattern of neglect, intentional disposal, or devaluation of such items, especially those formally transferred, could trigger a reassessment clause. A reassessment that would shift control of the trust. Not to Daniel, but to a secondary party. I sat there for a long time after that. Not moving. Not reacting. Just absorbing. Because suddenly, the afternoon at the curb wasn't just a moment of carelessness. It was evidence. Clea's words echoed back, sharper now. Nobody wants your old dead energy. Daniel's voice followed. It's just stuff. I closed the folder gently. There was no anger in me. It's not anymore. Anger is loud, reactive, it demands immediate action. This wasn't that. This was clarity. For the first time since Alina passed, I felt like I was seeing the full picture she had left behind. Not just the memories, not just the objects, but the structure, the quiet safeguards she had put in place. She hadn't been holding on to the past. She had been preparing for the future. And more importantly, she had been waiting. Waiting to see who Daniel would become when no one was watching, when the weight of her presence was gone, when the choices he made were entirely his own. And now I had my answer. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff from hours on the attic floor. The box remained open, its contents no longer just remnants of a life shared, but pieces of something far more deliberate. Downstairs, the house was silent. Empty in a way that felt different now. Not like something was missing, but like something had been revealed. I placed the folder back into the box, along with the ring and the documents, sealing it carefully. Then I carried it downstairs. Set it on the dining table, where the china set used to sit. And for a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine Alina across from me, watching quietly, the way she always did when she was waiting for me to understand something on my own. You saw this coming, didn't you? I said under my breath. The silence didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because the truth was already there. Daniel hadn't just dismissed a set of dishes. He had demonstrated something far more valuable than he realized. And Clea had made it undeniable. I turned off the lights and stood there in the dark for a moment longer than necessary. Not grieving. Not hesitating. Just deciding. Because whatever happened next wouldn't be emotional. It wouldn't be loud. And it certainly wouldn't be rushed. It would be deliberate. Careful. And when it was finished, they wouldn't be able to undo it. The next morning I didn't rush. I didn't call Daniel or Claire. I didn't make grand announcements or threats. Revenge of any kind, the kind that Alina would have approved, requires patience. Quiet, deliberate patience. It thrives in the spaces people assume are empty, in moments they overlook as insignificant. I sat at the empty dining table, staring at the box I had retrieved from the attic. The contents, the folder, the ring, the documents were carefully arranged. They weren't just objects, they were instruments. Tools for a plan Alina had conceived long before either of them realized there was a consequence for carelessness. I began my first task, gathering information. Daniel and Claire had no idea how much they'd revealed about themselves the day they tossed the china. They didn't realize that every careless word, every dismissive glance, every thoughtless action had been quietly documented, not literally, but in terms of their character, their habits, their sense of entitlement. Alina had built a framework for this, a system that didn't rely on chance or emotion, and now I would complete it. I went through every detail of the trust, every clause, every footnote, every contingency. The language was precise, written to the letter. Intentional neglect demonstrated devaluation, failure to preserve sentimental or historical assets, all terms that could be interpreted in my favor. Alina had trusted that I would know when the time was right. That time was now. Next, I prepared. I created a timeline of interactions, cross-referencing what had been discarded with what had been left untouched, mapping the hierarchy of carelessness. I made notes as if cataloging every slight against memory and history. Every careless touch, every thoughtless word became ammunition. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scheming blindly. I was documenting. I was preparing for the exact moment when the truth would reveal itself in its full, devastating clarity. I realized something crucial. The strength of this revenge wasn't in the material wealth or the legal leverage. It wasn't even in the threat of reclaiming control. Its power was psychological. Daniel and Claire believed they were untouchable because they were ignorant. That ignorance would be the trap. When you underestimate someone, when you believe that carelessness has no consequence, the eventual reckoning lands with a force you cannot resist. I spent the next week observing quietly, not in a stalkerish sense, nothing dramatic, but by piecing together patterns. Where did Claire spend her free time? Which friends did they trust with opinions about household matters? How did Daniel respond when confronted with small inconveniences? Every observation reinforced what I already knew. They were arrogant, confident, and blind to the real value of things that weren't immediately measurable in money. I also began to rebuild my own position. I sought counsel, not to reveal my intentions, but to ensure that when the time came, everything would be legally bulletproof. Lawyers, financial advisors, estate planners. I spoke to them under the guise of general retirement and inheritance planning. They gave me advice, unknowingly confirming that every move I planned would be untouchable once executed. Meanwhile, I started small, subtle adjustments to the household's perception of me, a quiet remark here, a suggestion there, planting seeds of doubt, reminders of my attentiveness, hints that I had retained knowledge they assumed was lost. It was almost imperceptible. The best revenge always starts under the radar, where it can grow unnoticed until it is unavoidable. At home, the attic box remained untouched. I didn't reveal it. I didn't flaunt it. It sat as a silent promise, a beacon of inevitability. And every time I saw the empty cabinet where the china once lived, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. They thought they had erased history. They had only begun to rewrite it under my guidance. I also revisited Alina's personal notes. Her handwriting, her strategies, her calm insistence that patience was strength, these were not just memories. They were a roadmap. For months she had anticipated scenarios like this. Careless heirs, entitled family members, people who mistook sentimentality for weakness. Every potential misstep was accounted for. Every insult had a countermeasure. By the end of that week, I felt a shift in myself. Not arrogance, not hatred, something steadier. Clarity, purpose, the kind of awareness that only comes when you realize the full scope of what is possible. They had acted with disregard. I would act with precision. And the precision was already taking shape. I started drafting letters, preparing documents, organizing evidence of Claire and Daniel's treatment of the china set, along with supporting details of their casual disregard for other family heirlooms. I collected photographs, receipts, even social media posts that proved their indifference. Every tiny piece, when arranged correctly, would form a pattern too coherent to ignore. By the end of the second week, the plan had taken form in my mind. Deliberate, inevitable, elegant. It wouldn't be messy. It wouldn't be loud. It would be undeniable. They believed they had already won. They had discarded my wife's legacy with a careless flick of the wrist. They had assumed that inheritance, memory, and respect were theirs to redefine. But the truth, Alina's truth, had a patient witness. And I had a plan that would make them wish they had treated history, memory, and family with the care they deserved. They were about to learn that every action has consequences, every careless word has a weight, and that night in the attic, the forgotten box had become my blueprint. The execution didn't happen all at once. That's the beauty of a plan crafted over decades by someone like Alina, and completed with the same meticulous care she had instilled in me. Precision matters more than haste. Every step needed to feel natural, inevitable, and completely unsuspected. I began with Daniel. It started subtly, a casual conversation masked as concern. "Daniel," I said one evening over dinner, "have you ever thought about how carefully we handle family heirlooms? Not just their value, but the history they carry." He shrugged, as he always did, assuming the conversation was idle nostalgia. "They're just things, Dad. I mean, they're nice, sure, but it's not like we're hurting anyone by putting them in storage or donating them." Exactly. That casual admission was a confirmation. His words, spoken freely, without realizing their significance, were evidence of intent. His attitude toward my wife's china was not an isolated incident, it was a pattern, a repeated demonstration of disregard. Next came Claire. I didn't confront her directly either. That would have been reckless. Instead, I created situations where her behavior revealed itself further. Invitations to events where she had to make decisions about inherited items. Small gifts that tested her care for delicate or historically significant objects. Every careless comment, every dismissive action was quietly documented. Meanwhile, I prepared the legal groundwork. The trust Alina had left behind wasn't a blunt instrument. It was a precise mechanism designed to redistribute control in the event of negligence. I met with attorneys under the guise of general estate planning, ensuring every clause could be activated without ambiguity. Every loose end Alina had anticipated was secured. The trust wasn't just a plan, it was a trap, waiting for the moment to spring. And then came the day of the first subtle strike. I sent a casual email to Daniel, copied to Claire about updating the inventory of family heirlooms. Innocuous, right? They didn't suspect anything. The message was just a routine check-in on the surface. But it prompted them to respond in ways that only confirmed the narrative I needed. Daniel admitted in writing that the china set and other items had been reallocated or disposed of, casually, without thought. Claire added her own remark: that old, useless stuff had been donated because nobody wants it. Every word was catalogued, stored, and ready to be presented in the legal context that Alina had foreseen. The next step required a little performance, a casual family gathering orchestrated by me. I invited them over under the guise of reviewing the new apartment and passing along a few miscellaneous items. The china box, empty but symbolically placed on the table, was visible. Subtle glances, small comments, it planted seeds of awareness without overt confrontation. I could see Claire's eyes flick to it, the tension she didn't realize she was feeling. Then, the real trigger. I filed the first motion to activate the reassessment clause in Alina's trust. It was quiet, legal, untouchable. I wasn't taking anything from Daniel or Claire outright. I wasn't punishing them with malice. I was letting the mechanism Alina had designed work exactly as intended. Their words, their actions, their casual dismissals, they had done the work themselves. The law took its course slowly. Notices were delivered, discussions scheduled. They were forced to engage, to explain, to account for their behavior in the exact context Alina had set. And every time they tried to downplay it, every excuse they offered, it only strengthened my position. They hadn't even realized the ground beneath them was shifting. 1 week later, the secondary trustee, a neutral third party named in Alina's plan, sent formal communication. Daniel and Claire were informed that certain assets were being reallocated due to documented negligence regarding family heirlooms and sentimental items. The moment wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet click of realization when they understood what had happened. Daniel's face went pale. Claire's mouth opened and closed several times, words failing her. And all the while, I stayed calm, detached, watching them realize, piece by piece, that their careless dismissals had consequences, that the inheritance they assumed was theirs had conditions they had failed to meet, that the stuff they tossed aside had not only emotional weight but legal and historical weight as well. The next steps involved orchestrating further consequences for Claire. Subtle adjustments to her household plans, reminders of obligations, legal prompts that ensured she would personally witness the repercussions of her earlier dismissals. By the time the dust settled, what had started as an innocuous donation box on the curb had evolved into a chain reaction. A legal and psychological domino effect that left Daniel and Clea scrambling to retain even a fraction of what they thought they had secured. Every step I took was deliberate, calm, methodical, never cruel, always just. And at the center of it all, sitting quietly on my dining table, was the box from the attic. Its contents, the folder, the ring, the documents, had become the fulcrum of an inevitable reckoning. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The elegance of the plan was in its inevitability. They had written their own defeat with every careless word, every dismissive glance, every act of thoughtless entitlement. All I had done was let Alina's design and the natural consequences of their behavior play out. By the end of the month, the initial shock had worn off. Daniel and Clea were forced to negotiate, reconcile, and account for their actions in ways they had never anticipated. The law, Alina's foresight, and their own carelessness had converged into a reality they couldn't escape. And through it all, I remained steady, observing, knowing that what had begun with a tossed china set had transformed into something far larger, something permanent. Something that would ensure they never underestimated me, or the legacy of Alina, again. Just when I thought the execution had gone flawlessly, the universe decided to remind me that even the most carefully laid plans carry a margin of unpredictability. It happened 2 weeks after the initial reassessment notice had been delivered. I was at home, reviewing the final inventory of assets now under my temporary control. The box from the attic sat on the dining table, open as always, a quiet sentinel. I had been cross-referencing documents when my phone rang. The caller ID read, Daniel. Ordinarily, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something in his tone when I answered immediately caught my attention. There was a sharpness there, an edge I hadn't heard before. Dad, he said, voice taut, I found something Mom left that you didn't tell us about. I paused. Oh, my tone was even, controlled, neutral, the calm before the storm. He hesitated. I think there's another document, another clause, and if it exists it could undo what's been happening. That prick of uncertainty was exactly what I expected. Not that Daniel had uncovered a secret that would affect the trust, but that he thought he had. I didn't give him a chance to elaborate. I said quietly, if you found something, bring it over, let's review it together. He arrived that afternoon, clutching a folder. His hands trembled slightly, partly anger, partly desperation, partly excitement. Clea was with him, her usual poise cracked, replaced with that sharp anxiety I had seen flicker the day they threw the china set in the donation bin. They placed the folder on the dining table. I remained seated, silent, calm, letting them feel the tension they had inadvertently created for themselves. Daniel opened the folder with a flourish, almost triumphantly, as if he had unearthed a game-changing weapon. Look, he said, this was filed years ago after Mom passed. It could reverse the reassessment, depending on how it's interpreted. I glanced at the documents casually. The handwriting was unfamiliar, legalese, dense, technical, and yes, it appeared to have some potential to challenge portions of the trust, but I already knew the truth. Alina had anticipated this. You're right, I said slowly. It could, but it doesn't. Daniel blinked. What do you mean it does? I leaned back, folding my hands. It doesn't because the clause you're pointing to is conditional, just like the one I activated. It only comes into play if a completely different set of conditions is met, which they're not. Your actions and Clea already fulfill the criteria for the reassessment to stand. Clea's face drained of color, but it says we can challenge. Yes, I said softly. You can challenge it, you just won't succeed. Everything has been documented. Every careless disposal, every dismissive comment, every word you've written about old dead energy, it's all admissible, all deliberate, all undeniable. For a moment, they stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. The air was heavy with disbelief. Then the twist revealed itself fully. Daniel had assumed that because he found this document, it was a secret loophole, an escape route. But the very act of seeking it out, of believing he could manipulate it, only reinforced Alina's design. She had embedded safeguards for anyone clever or desperate enough to look for exceptions. Every potential twist they could imagine had been anticipated, and the mechanisms to neutralize it were already in place. In that moment, I realized something crucial. The first twist wasn't theirs, it was mine. By allowing them to believe they had uncovered a loophole, I had set them up to reveal more of themselves. More careless behavior, more entitlement, more arrogance. Every word they spoke in frustration, every assumption they made about the legal language was being captured in real time. If I had needed additional evidence, which I didn't, it was all being generated for me. The real victory was psychological. Daniel and Claire had just convinced themselves that they might regain control, when in reality, they were tightening the very trap that would ensure their total loss. I leaned forward, finally opening the velvet case to reveal Alina's ring. The glint of the stone caught their eyes. And this, I said, placing it gently on the table, remains with the person who honors the intent behind these heirlooms, not the one who discards them, not the one who mocks them, but the one who understands their weight. They exchanged a glance. I could see the panic beginning to creep in, the realization that they had not only failed, but that their own assumptions had amplified their failure. By the end of that meeting, they left shaken. Daniel muttered something about consulting lawyers. Claire fumed silently, her usual composure gone, and I remained, as always, calm, watching, waiting, because now the plan wasn't just legal, it was inevitable. They thought they had found a way out. They hadn't. And in that subtle miscalculation, they had just stepped deeper into the trap Alina and I had designed together. The days that followed the first twist were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Daniel and Claire didn't call, didn't come by. Their silence was telling. I didn't need it to be anything more than that. It was the calm before the full impact of the plan hit them. I spent my mornings reviewing everything carefully. The trust documents, Alina's notes, the evidence they had unintentionally provided, and the timelines of their actions. Every careless word, every flippant remark, every "it's just stuff" moment now read like a confessional. Then came the first official notice. A letter sent by the secondary trustee Alina had appointed long ago, a lawyer I had never met personally, but whose role had been clearly defined. The letter summarized the reassessment of the trust's assets due to demonstrated neglect of family-designated heirlooms and assets of sentimental or historical value. It cited specifics, dates, and even direct quotes from emails, messages, and documented statements from Daniel and Claire. Every piece of evidence was airtight. I knew they had to see it at the same time, so I arranged a formal meeting. Daniel and Claire arrived, both pale, their usual confidence eroded by the slow, inescapable reality that they were facing the consequences of their own actions. The trustee began reading the letter aloud. Every point highlighted their carelessness. The china set tossed into the donation box, the dismissive comments about old dead energy, their lack of consideration for other inherited heirlooms, and the repeated disregard for the conditions of the trust. Claire's face went white, and Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but neither interrupted. Every word they had spoken months before, every action they had taken, now worked against them. When the reading concluded, there was silence. Only the sound of their heavy breathing filled the room. "That's it?" Daniel finally asked, his voice shaking. We can't, there has to be some way." "You've already demonstrated everything necessary," I said calmly. "Your actions, your words, they're documented. The reassessment is in full effect. Alina planned for this. I am merely the executor of her intent." Claire's eyes flicked to the box on the dining table, the one that had remained untouched since I retrieved it from the attic. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came, because she knew, she could see it now. The quiet power of the plan she had mocked, dismissed, and belittled. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the turning point. I reached into the box and pulled out Alina's ring, placing it on the table between us. "This," I said softly, "is not just a ring. It is a symbol of respect, of care, of understanding. It belongs to the person who honors the legacy behind it, not to those who discard it, who mock it, who treat it as nothing." Claire's hand twitched. She wanted it. She wanted the ring because she assumed she could still claim some control, some part of the inheritance. Daniel, too, stared, as if realizing for the first time that he had never truly understood the weight of what Alina had left behind. I leaned back, my expression calm, almost serene. "You had every opportunity to preserve, to respect, to understand. You chose not to. Every step you took confirmed the reassessment was justified. The trust isn't a threat, it's a consequence. And consequences, as Alina knew, are absolute when earned." For a moment, they sat frozen, the gravity of the situation finally settling in. They had underestimated me, underestimated Alina, and underestimated the meticulous care with which she had structured her legacy. Daniel spoke first, his voice barely audible. We didn't think it mattered, we thought." "It mattered," I interrupted gently. "It always mattered. That's why Alina planned for exactly this scenario. That's why she left the instructions, the documents, the conditions. Your actions didn't just fail, they confirmed everything the plan was designed to test." The trustee nodded in agreement, silently reinforcing the legal reality of the situation. And then I watched the real transformation begin. Their initial shock shifted into desperation, and desperation into understanding. Not complete understanding, never that, but enough to realize that they were no longer in control. That every casual dismissal, every careless joke, every "it's just stuff" remark had built the very trap they had now fallen into. By the end of that meeting, they left the room not just humbled, but fundamentally altered. The confidence and entitlement they had carried so proudly for years were gone, replaced by the stark realization that they had played themselves, and that the consequences were irreversible. I remained seated, the box open before me, Alina's ring gleaming under the light. I didn't need to say more. They had learned the lesson silently, painfully, in full view of the consequences their own behavior had created. And I knew in that moment that the turning point had been reached. The trap was fully sprung, and the slow, deliberate reckoning was now unstoppable. I thought the plan had reached its zenith after the turning point, that Daniel and Claire were humbled, shaken, and finally under the quiet authority of Alina's foresight. But life, as it often does, offered an additional layer, one I hadn't entirely anticipated, or perhaps one Alina had left as a secret safeguard, just to ensure the plan remained untouchable. It began with a call from the secondary trustee. Her voice was measured but tinged with surprise. "Mr. Harper," she said, "there's something you should know, something you might want to see in person before finalizing the final allocations." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Apparently, in reviewing some of the supporting documents, those old letters and notes Alina had left, which I had already catalogued carefully, she discovered a clause I hadn't paid attention to. It was subtle, almost invisible, written in the margins of one of Alina's hand-annotated pages, something that could have thrown a wrench into the reassessment entirely if mishandled. I smiled, not because it threatened the plan, but because it added an additional opportunity. A second twist, as if Alina herself were reminding me that true revenge is never predictable. I drove to the trustee's office, the documents carefully folded in an envelope. Daniel and Claire were informed that they could attend, under the guise of reviewing potential adjustments. Of course, they had no idea the adjustments would work entirely against them. When they arrived, I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor. They were cautious now, hesitant. The arrogance they had worn for so long had been replaced with uncertainty, their eyes flicking constantly to the box of heirlooms I had left at home, the symbolic presence still haunting them. The trustee began laying out the discovery. Alina had included a clause that allowed her to grant discretionary authority to a third party, but only if that third party demonstrated not just legal understanding, but careful judgment and respect for family legacy. The clause was designed as a fail-safe, in case someone attempted to challenge the reassessment. And here's the twist: Daniel and Claire, in their desperation, had already acted in ways that disqualified themselves from any potential adjustment. By even raising the possibility of a challenge, by digging through documents and claiming loopholes, they had violated the spirit of the trust. Every action they took in attempting to regain control only reinforced Alina's judgment against them. I leaned back slightly, watching as realization dawned on them. Their hopes of circumventing the reassessment, of reclaiming even a fraction of what they thought was theirs, collapsed in real time. Claire's voice cracked, "But we were just trying to understand it, we didn't." "Intent matters less than action," I said calmly. "Every choice you've made has been documented. Every attempt to undermine the process has only confirmed the reassessment's validity. You've played yourselves further into Alina's design." Daniel slumped in his chair. "We didn't know, we thought that your entitlement would protect you," I interjected. "No, it never did, and it never will." Alina anticipated every what-if, every loophole, every misguided attempt at cleverness, and she built a structure that rewards those who respect the past and punishes those who discard it carelessly. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, the trustee added a final note. The discretionary authority now rested fully with me, with explicit power to determine the allocation of remaining heirlooms and assets in Alina's name. Daniel and Claire were forced to watch as control passed irrevocably, their legal options nullified by the very strategy they had hoped to manipulate. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had assumed knowledge would save them. Instead, it had sealed their fate. By the end of the day, the second twist had cemented their downfall. It wasn't just that the reassessment had succeeded, it was that their own attempts to challenge it had accelerated their losses. Every arrogant assumption, every careless dismissal, had compounded into irreversible consequences. I left the trustee's office with a calm satisfaction. The second twist had done what I hadn't fully anticipated. It transformed the plan from mere legal and psychological mastery into a story of poetic justice that even Daniel and Claire couldn't escape. And as I drove home, I realized the ultimate truth. The china set, the documents, the ring, and the attic box weren't just tools, they were instruments of inevitability. Every careless choice, every flippant remark, every just stuff had been accounted for, and every one of them had contributed to the masterpiece of Alina's revenge, and now mine. By the following week, the shift was complete. Daniel and Clea no longer moved through their home with confidence. Every room, every shelf, every corner that once symbolized their assumed control now reminded them of their failures. The reassessment had taken effect, and the remaining assets of Alina's estate were formally under my management. The irony was deliciously methodical. They had treated her heirlooms and the trust with casual disregard, thinking the law, the money, and history would bend to their convenience. Now they were confronted with the opposite. Every decision they had made, every careless word, every dismissive action, had been codified as evidence against them. The first consequence unfolded quietly. I began redistributing assets in accordance with Alina's wishes, favoring institutions, charities, and distant family members who respected legacy. Carefully, I placed heirlooms, documents, and investments where they would be honored, not as punishment for Daniel and Clea per se, but as fulfillment of Alina's vision. Then came the psychological reinforcement. Each time Daniel or Clea attempted to discuss a revision, they were reminded that their actions had triggered the reassessment. Letters arrived, summaries were issued, and every attempt to regain control was met with airtight documentation. Each reminder reinforced the inevitability of their loss. They began to shrink, both in stature and in confidence. One morning, I arranged a small, symbolic gesture. I called them to the house, claiming we needed to sort through a minor portion of Alina's personal items. When they arrived, I led them to the dining room, where the empty cabinet for the china set stood prominently. I didn't speak. I let the empty space do the talking. The memory of that afternoon when Clea tossed the set into the donation box lingered between us like a ghost. Clea's eyes fell on the floor, where the attic box had once rested openly, now gone, relocated to a secure storage facility under my control. The symbolism was unmistakable. Control had shifted permanently, and their attempts to reclaim it were futile. Daniel spoke first, hesitantly. We just didn't understand. No, I said calmly, you did understand. You chose to ignore it. You chose to treat history as disposable. That's the only reason this outcome exists. The silence that followed was telling. They had nothing left to argue. Every just stuff they had dismissed had returned with consequence. Every casual remark Clea had made about old dead energy echoed in their own consciousness. The real reversal, however, was subtle. They had assumed that wealth and material items equaled power, but the actual power, the influence over memory, history, and legacy was now in my hands. With each heirloom, each document, each carefully curated allocation, I demonstrated that true control didn't belong to those who claimed it loudly. It belonged to those who understood it quietly, who acted deliberately, and who respected the past. In the following weeks, Daniel and Clea retreated further. Socially, they began to distance themselves, embarrassed by the way word of the reassessment and redistribution had spread quietly among family circles. Mutual friends, once allies, now treated them with a subtle mixture of respect and incredulity at how completely they had mishandled the inheritance. The most satisfying reversal, though, was personal. I had once stood powerless as they tossed my wife's china into a donation bin. Now I held the power that mattered, not just legally, but psychologically. Every glance they cast my way carried hesitation, uncertainty, and the faintest trace of fear. They realized too late that what they had dismissed as just stuff had been the cornerstone of their undoing. I didn't gloat, I didn't need to. The reversal was total and self-evident. Daniel and Clea's confidence had been replaced with humility, their entitlement replaced with caution. Their world, which had once seemed theirs by default, now operated under the undeniable authority of Alina's foresight, and my execution of it. It was a quiet, pervasive victory, not flashy, not loud, but complete. Every element of their previous arrogance had been dismantled without a single outburst, without a single malicious act beyond careful legal and psychological strategy. By the time I finally sat alone in the house, the attic empty, the dining room clear, and the heirlooms secured, I understood the depth of what had been accomplished. The fallout had been reversed completely. The ones who had believed they controlled everything now had to accept the truth. They hadn't controlled a thing. History, memory, and consequence had claimed their place, and they had learned, painfully, that it always will. I never told Daniel and Clea exactly how much of Alina's foresight had been in play, nor did I need to. By the time they fully grasped the scope of the reassessment, the redistribution, and the legal precision of every move, it was already too late. Their arrogance had blinded them to the simplest truth. The past cannot be discarded without cost, and legacy is never given, it is earned or lost. The house was quiet, the attic was empty. The dining room, once a stage for casual dismissals and careless words, now held only a single symbol of authority: Alina's ring, carefully displayed in its original velvet case. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Its presence alone conveyed the gravity of respect, patience, and strategy. Daniel and Claire had retreated. Socially, legally, emotionally, they had been stripped of the illusion of power they once wielded so casually. I watched from the living room, my hands folded over a cup of tea, and I realized something that made the quiet victory feel even sweeter. The greatest revenge isn't loud or public. It isn't spiteful or vengeful. The greatest revenge is the one that moves invisibly, methodically, until it becomes unavoidable. And in that moment, I thought of Alina. She had planned this with a patience I could never fully admire enough, but I had executed it with precision, care, and a clarity of purpose that ensured her legacy was honored and her foresight validated. The china set, the attic box, the documents, the ring, all had been pieces of a puzzle Daniel and Claire never understood. I leaned back, feeling the weight lift from years of quiet anticipation and observation. They had thought they had tossed away my wife's life and legacy with careless hands. They hadn't realized they were discarding their own claim to the respect and inheritance they assumed would be theirs. And in that silence, the final truth was undeniable. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile as I whispered softly, just to the empty room. You thought it was just stuff, but history has a memory and it never forgets. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete, absolute. The reckoning had been delivered, subtle yet irrefutable. And in that quiet, I finally felt the full weight of justice fulfilled, not through anger, not through spectacle, but through the inevitability of consequence. Alina's legacy was intact, mine deliberate, and theirs irrevocably undone.